I feel like I haven't done any camera review for a long time. It's probably because I was away in Japan and Australia last few months, and then when I came back, I got a lot of catching up to do. But today, we are going to review another lens. It is the Brightin Star 50mm f/0.95 Mark II. This is a manual-focus lens for full-frame cameras. It's completely mechanical. There isn't any electronic components. There's no autofocus or any other electronic features. In the past, on this channel, we have reviewed a lot of manual-focus lenses like this, but I feel like maybe the last year or two, I really haven't reviewed too many of these type of lenses. I guess one of the reasons is because a lot of the Chinese lens manufacturer has shifted from creating some manual focus lenses to autofocus lenses. So that's what I have been reviewing a lot over the last 2 years. And another reason is just, I think I have been reviewing those type of lenses, so many of them, so I feel a little bit bored reviewing those lenses. But this time, when Brightin Star contacted me and told me that they are going to release this lens, I told them that I'm very interested in reviewing this lens because when I reviewed the original version a few years ago, that is a very interesting lens. That lens has the ultra-fast f/0.95 aperture, and the image quality, it has some very special character, and the build quality is pretty good, and the price is also very affordable. And Brightin Star told me this Mark II version is an improvement in quite a few areas compared to the original version. So I'm very interested in reviewing this lens and see what are the changes, what are the improvements. So this lens is available in the Sony E, Nikon Z, Canon RF, and also the Leica L mount. When I reviewed the original version, I reviewed it in L mount. So this time I asked Brightin Star to also send me the L mount version so that I can compare the two lenses. And just the usual disclaimer, Brightin Star sent me the lens sample for this review. I don't have to return it to them after the review, but as usual, I have not received any money, and I'm going to share with you all the pros and cons I found about this lens. So I'm driving to the Auckland CBD right now. Actually, I pretty much arrived there. It is about 8 o'clock in the evening, and because it is almost summer here in New Zealand, so the sky is not dark yet, but I think it should be getting dark in probably 15-20 minutes or so. So by the time I park my car, it will be dark. I think for a lens like this, it is very important to test it after dark because I can see how it performs under low light condition, and also I can see the bokeh, how does the bokeh look. I also have the original version of the Brightin Star 50mm f/0.95 in my camera bag, so I'm going to do some side-by-side tests and see how is the photo look like from the Mark II compared to the original version. So, why do we even need an f0.95 lens? Is it just because we are obsessed with crazy fast apertures? Well, maybe a little bit, but there are also some practical reasons. First, shooting under low light. With f0.95, you don't need to push your ISO as high, so your photos stay a bit cleaner. But then, to be honest, the latest full frame sensor has really good high ISO performance. The benefit of shooting at lower ISO is not really that important. So the main reason for a f0.95 lens, I think, is the shallow depth of field. And yes, even a 50mm f1.4 lens already gives you very shallow depth of field when you are shooting close-ups. For head and shoulder or half-body portraits, the difference between f1.4 and f0.95 isn't huge because the background is usually melted anyway. But for me, I think the real difference is when your subject is a little bit further away, say around 10 meters. Shooting at f0.95 can still give you that slight background separation, just enough to make your subject pop from the background. For example, this photo I shot at f0.95 with this Brightin Star lens. The photo looks really quite different and is something I can create using a normal 50mm f1.4 lens. Okay then, why should we consider a manual focus lens? Isn't it very hard to manual focus such a fast lens? Well, there isn't really an autofocus f0.95 lens. If you want f0.95, you pretty much have to manual focus. But the good news is, on modern mirrorless cameras, manual focusing is so much easier than it used to be. You've got focus peaking, magnification, and if you're lucky, your camera may also have a large high-resolution electronic viewfinder, none of which exists on DSLR cameras, where nailing focus at f0.95 was almost impossible. Manual focusing at f0.95 is still challenging, but with a bit of skills and practice, is absolutely manageable on any current mirrorless camera. Okay, now let's talk about sharpness. When shooting wide open at f0.95, it's definitely not razor sharp, and you can also see quite a bit of chromatic aberration. The corners are soft, but for an f0.95 lens at this price, I'm not expecting anywhere near perfection at maximum aperture. When you stop down to f1.4, the center sharpens up a lot. For the corners though, you need to stop down further. Around f2.8 is where they start to look good. I also tried focusing in the center versus focusing in the corner, and the corner sharpness didn't really change. That tells me the lens doesn't have too much field curvature, which is nice. I compared this Mark II version with the original Mark I version. The Mark II is a little bit sharper, especially wide open. Next, let's look at this brick wall test photo. The distortion is quite noticeable, more than what you usually see from a typical 50mm lens, and when I compared it with the Mark I, the distortion pattern is almost identical. The field of view is basically the same as well. It's pretty rare for two lenses to have almost the same distortion pattern and the same field of view, so after seeing this, I checked the specs for both lenses and noticed the optical design appears to be the same. I then contacted Brightin Star and they confirmed that the Mark II uses the same optical formula as the original version. The difference is that the Mark II now uses higher grade optical glasses, and they've also updated the Super MC multi-layer coating. Looking at these distortion test photos, I did spot a small color difference, even though both photos were shot within 1 minute using the same exposure and white balance settings. The Mark II image leans slightly towards magenta, while the Mark I has a slight green tint. The difference is very small, so it's probably not something you'll notice in real-world shooting, but it does confirm that the new glass or coating isn't exactly the same as the Mark I. The minimum focus distance is around 50 cm, and the maximum magnification, according to my calculation, is around 0.1 time, which is also the same as the Mark I. When taking close-up photo at f0.95, the image is really soft. If you want the image to be sharper, you need to stop down the lens quite a bit. Okay, now let's look at vignetting performance. Just like the original version, we have strong vignetting at f0.95, which is not surprising to be honest. Stop down the lens will gradually improve vignetting. At f4, vignetting becomes quite minor. Stopping down the lens further makes almost no difference to vignetting. Now if we compare these two lenses, Mark II's vignetting looks almost identical to the original version at all the different aperture settings. With the ultra-fast aperture, it is very easy to melt the background, especially when your subject is within a few meters distance. Shallow depth of field is one thing, but what about bokeh, the rendering of the out of focus area? The bokeh from this f0.95 lens is very interesting. When you shoot at f0.95, there is quite a bit of swirly bokeh near the edges, especially the foreground bokeh. And quite often, the swirly bokeh is not the typical oval-shaped bokeh, it's more like a bow shape pointing towards the center of the photo. And sometimes it looks like a triangle shape if the bokeh ball is small, which looks like it may be caused by chroma flare. While the shape of the bokeh ball is a bit unusual, the transition at the edge of the bokeh ball is quite smooth. I don't really see too much halo ring. And if I compare Mark II with the Mark I, the Mark I's bokeh tends to have a bit more highlight near the edge, and because of that, the Mark II's out of focus rendering appears to be a bit smoother than the Mark I. Chromatic aberration can be quite noticeable, especially when shooting high contrast scene at wide open. It was like that with the Mark I, and I don't really see any noticeable difference with the Mark II. Chromatic aberration can be quite obvious, so sometimes you may have to stop down the lens a bit to reduce the amount of chromatic aberration when you are shooting high contrast scene. When I change focus between 1 meter and 10 meter, I can see some pretty noticeable focus breathing. Look at this video, you can see the change in field of view quite easily. The amount of focus breathing seems to be the same as the Mark I. Brightin Star says the Mark II has improved lens flare performance, which should help with backlit shooting. From my side-by-side comparisons, I do see some differences. The Mark II has less lens flare, and the overall contrast also looks a little bit better compared to the Mark I. But is it a huge difference? Well, it depends. In some of my tests, the difference is quite small. Like in this comparison, the Mark II has slightly less lens flare. But in some other situations, like this comparison, I see a more noticeable improvement. That said, the Mark II can still produce quite a bit of lens flare if there is a strong light source in front of the lens. But I actually think the lens flare looks beautiful, so I don't really see it as a downside. But if you don't want to have too much lens flare, extending the lens hood helps a lot. The lens hood of the Mark II also has a new lockable design, which I'll talk about more very soon. One thing that is really interesting about the Mark I version is that it can render some pretty sharp Sunstars at f1.4 aperture. So that means you could capture photos that has both Sunstars and bokeh balls in the background by shooting at f1.4. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen anymore with the Mark II. Unlike the Mark I, which can render sharp, beautiful Sunstars at almost any aperture apart from f0.95 and f22, Sunstars from the Mark II just look a bit messy to me even if I stop down the lens to minimum aperture. Okay, now let's talk about the build quality and construction of the lens. As I've mentioned at the beginning, this lens is a completely manual mechanical lens. No electronic contacts, no autofocus motor, nothing electronic inside. For a full-frame 50mm f0.95 lens, the size is actually quite small, but at around 750 grams or about 1.7 pounds, it's definitely heavy for a 50mm lens. When I was shooting with the Lumix S1 II, my hand could feel the weight and become sore pretty quickly. The weight mainly comes from the all-metal construction. The lens feels extremely solid. Solid enough that you could probably use it as a weapon to defend yourself if someone tried to rob you. The overall design and size of the Mark II are very similar to the Mark I, which makes sense now we know the optical design is the same. But the body also has a few small and not so small changes. The first thing I noticed when I pick up the lens is the finish. The paint on the Mark II feels nicer and a bit more premium. The front element has a slight different color, which confirms the updated coating used on the Mark II. The Mark I had a built-in retractable lens hood. The Mark II keeps that idea, but improves it. When you extend the hood, you can twist it and lock it in the extended position. So even if the lens bumps into something or you put the lens back into your camera bag, the hood won't slide back in accidentally. This really reduces the chance of shooting without realizing the hood has retracted. And if you have watched my Mark I review, you may remember I complained the lens hood is quite thin and feel a bit flimsy compared to the very solid body of the lens. The Mark II's lens hood is now thicker and much sturdier, which is great. Also in my Mark I review, I mentioned that the red dot showing your aperture position becomes hidden when the lens hood is retracted, so you cannot see the aperture value. On the Mark II, Brightin Star added an extra marking on the lens barrel, so you can always see your aperture value whether the lens hood is extended or not. The focus flow is still around 170 degrees, just like the Mark I. The focus ring feels a little bit smoother and easier to turn, but it still has enough resistance so it won't move on its own. The aperture ring is also mechanical with click stops, just like the Mark I. It's one click per full stop, so you cannot do half stop or 1/3 stop changes. In my Mark I review, I said the aperture ring didn't feel very satisfying. The Mark II version now feels much better. Now, so far, most of the changes are very positive. But there's one thing I'm a bit disappointed about. It is the packaging. The Mark I came in a really beautiful box. Honestly, it is one of the nicest, almost luxury packaging I've seen for a budget lens. The Mark II's packaging is much more standard. To be fair, it's not bad. It's still better than average, but it's nowhere near as premium or special as the Mark I's box. When the Mark I came out about 4 years ago, the ultra-fast aperture, the unique character, and the very affordable price made it stand out. And even now, 4 years later, it's still a special lens because there just are not too many options like this on the market. The Mark II isn't a huge redesign. It's more of a refinement and evolution. The overall design is largely the same as the Mark I, but all the small changes and improvements make the Mark II feels more polished and delivers a more satisfying manual-focused shooting experience. Improvements like the lockable lens hood and the new aperture indicator also make the lens easier to use day to day. Optically, it is a small step forward. The Mark II seems a little bit sharper and handles lens flare better than the original version. The downside is that the beautiful Sunstars from the Mark I is gone. But aside from that, most of the changes are very positive. The standard price of the Mark II is $409 US, which is only a slight increase over the original, and you can often find it for less. I've seen a 10% discount on their website just right now. But even without discount, it's a very tempting option if you want to play with an ultra-fast lens without spending a huge amount of money. My recommendation is quite similar to what I said in my Mark I review. I wouldn't suggest this lens to complete beginners. Even with modern mirrorless cameras, manual focus at f0.95 still takes some practice. It may overwhelm complete beginners. But if you believe you have already passed that beginner level, and if you want to experience the fun and creative look of an f0.95 lens, this Brightin Star 50mm f0.95 Mark II is a very appealing choice.